It's May 18th, and we're doing another interview about the International Energy Agency's new net zero by 2050 pathways report. We're going to be talking to Dr. Sara Hastings-Simon of the University of Calgary about the Canadian oil and gas industry and how, if that scenario becomes the objective of global governments, what implications are there for Canada? So welcome to the interview, Sara.
Thanks, Markham.
Now, the Canadian oil and gas industry, particularly because it's dominated by the oil sands, it generates about 80% of Canadian oil. They tend to be very conservative. And if it seems to me that if global governments at COP26 coming up this fall, if they kind of commit to this scenario, it might spell trouble for Canadian oil and gas.
Yes, I think that's right. So, I mean, what the IEA released today, this net zero scenario is, one scenario of many. So, I mean, I am often on this horse of, a scenario is not a forecast. And that's something that I think is often misunderstood in this conversation. So it's, a potential future that could play out. And scenarios are really useful because they allow companies as well as policymakers to test future plans against or to test plans against what a future could look like. And so what this scenario today is telling us is that if the world acts in a way to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, if they are successful at doing so, then the demand for oil and gas and coal will decrease quite dramatically over the next couple of decades. And that is, a more aggressive decline, certainly than any of the Canadian scenarios I have been planning for. And it would be, as you say, it would be highly problematic for the sector within Canada.
Now, I had an article published in Alberta Views magazine. It was the March issue. And in it, I interviewed Janet Annesley, who was then a senior vice president for Husky Energy, since been merged with Cenovus. And in it, she talked about their modeling, and she said, our best case scenario, our strategy, according to our model, is to reduce our costs between now and 2050 and gradually reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. That they're not going to invest in, electricity generation like wind and solar farms, any of that kind of stuff. It's stick to your knitting, get your costs down, get your emissions down. And aside from Suncor, which has a slightly different wrinkle on this because they do invest in some renewables and so on, that seems to be the approach that almost all Canadian oil and gas companies are taking. If global governments commit to the IEA pathways that we're talking about, that sounds like it spells big trouble for Canadian oil and gas.
Yeah, I think it does, right? So much of the plans for many of the Canadian oil and gas companies, as you said, have basically relied on, if not a growing demand for oil and gas, at least a relatively steady demand for oil and gas over the coming years. And so, the business strategy is basically find ways to get costs down and emissions down so that they can continue to be a provider for that demand. And, in a world where oil and gas demand stays relatively flat, I think there is a fair amount of credibility to that, to such a strategy, right? So the idea that you try to compete on cost and you remain a part of that mix. And so the key thing then is what happens when that amount of demand starts to decline. And that's what we're seeing differently in this scenario that came out from the IEA today. One thing I'll note is that, I think the messenger is as equally important as the message in this case, because it's the scenario that IEA has shared, the net zero scenario is certainly not the first scenario that we have seen, which is a net zero scenario, which shows a dramatic decline in oil and gas coming from trusted providers of such energy scenarios. But it's the first time that the IEA has come out and shared something like this. And I think that's that's meaningful because I think historically they have really been sort of one of the most cited energy scenario providers by international governments. They've also been, of course, one of the more conservative in terms of future demand for oil and gas. And it's interesting, you know, they in the run up to this, they did release some forecasts for or some I guess projections, I think they were, for future solar and wind growth. And after, you know, many years of sort of under forecasting growth, they've actually really dramatically increased these projections. But what was interesting is that they called this, you know, a more aggressive but new normal. So it really seems to me that there is a bit of a shift in the thinking within the IEA around those forward-looking scenarios.
Yeah, we should point out that the IEA is, I think it's entirely funded by governments, if I understand correctly, the American government being the biggest one. And therefore, that advice and their projections and so on are paid a lot of heed by governments. And I would imagine probably by the Canadian government. And the Canadian government's attitude here, their approach to oil and gas has been very interesting and criticized by many environmental groups, because essentially what they've done is taken almost the IEA stance, which there will be a very gradual, you know, transition away from gas particularly, but a little more quickly for oil. And the Justin Trudeau government has, regardless of what Alberta Premier Jason Kenney thinks, the federal government has taken a fairly hands-off and gentle approach, I think, to the oil and gas industry. And I wonder if you think that if there was a new normal come out of COP26, that might change.
Well, you know, for the future of Canada and Alberta, I certainly hope it will change, because I think, you know, to me, what this scenario really is telling us is, you know, again, there are different scenarios for the future. And, you know, frankly, nobody knows exactly the way that the world is going to unfold and the energy transition is going to unfold. But I think what we're seeing is that there is an increased likelihood that we do get on something resembling this net zero pathway, whether it's exactly that or close to it. And what that really tells us is that, you know, if there is a real chance that this is what the future looks like, then Canada and Alberta, you know, better have an economic plan that is robust and that is going to create a prosperous future for the province and the country in a world where the demand for oil and gas declines rapidly. And until now, you know, we haven't seen that. We hear a lot about, you know, Canada is only going to be able to be prosperous if it has a strong oil and gas sector. And I think that kind of language is, you know, that's concerning in the light of these of additional scenarios coming up, because it's really saying, you know, if you take it at face value, you're really saying, you know, either the world fails to act on climate or Canada has a grim economic future. And I certainly don't want to live in either of those worlds. And so I think increasingly what we need is planning for this future where oil and gas demand is declining, and you know, as one of many.
Now, I want to ask you a related question, because if we're going to plan for the decline of oil and gas, well, the IEA scenario says that we also will see the rise of electricity. And the estimates that I've seen suggest that most national economies, including Canada, will use by 2050, maybe 2 times as much electricity, possibly as much as 3 times electricity. And so the question then becomes, is our national electricity system up to the task? And I'm writing a series of articles in which I argue it is not. It is basically designed for a 20th century economy, not for the scenario we're talking about, and that there are a lot of problems to be fixed. What's your take on that?
I mean, clearly we're going to need more electricity. And so we are going to need to grow both the amount of generation that we have, as well as, you know, the transmission and distribution systems. I will note that the kind of growth that we're talking about and the pace of growth in the demand for electricity is something that we experienced previously, right? And so we've been living in sort of this couple of decades now across North America with a relatively stagnant and even in some cases declining demand for electricity due to improvements, energy efficiency improvements. And so sort of a world where you're seeing increased demand for electricity might feel a little unfamiliar, but we only have to go back, you know, a few more decades before that to see that North America, you know, Canada and the US was building out an electricity system that was meeting that growing demand. So I do have I don't want to underplay the investment that's needed and the work that's needed, but I think it's important to put it in the context and understand that this is not a fundamentally unachievable goal if we put our mind to it. The other piece here is where kind of thermodynamics comes back into it, and we have to be really careful when we're talking about energy. We are often looking at primary energy. And so the amount of primary energy that goes into our energy systems. And when we're using oil and gas, when we're burning fossil fuels for heat, only a fraction of that energy is actually useful. We can use it to move our cars or move our machines or things like that. And so when we are talking about an electrified future, there's actually quite a bit of efficiency gains that you can get in there. And so the overall challenge itself looks somewhat less daunting, I think, when we also understand that we don't need to replace one for one every unit of primary energy that we get from fossil fuels today.
Well, Sarah, thank you very much for your insights, and the conversation about the Canadian electricity system is grist for another interview or two. So we'll save that for down the road. Thank you.
Sounds good.